Okay, we better get started. We're half an hour late already, so I hope we can finish the whole forum by 12:30. So, which means that we will really need to control our time better. So let me just lay down some ground rules for the panel discussion. I will ask the panelists to each give a 7-minute presentation of their own views and position on democracy for Hong Kong. You can speak in either Chinese or English, and Professor, you should get your headset on because we have a unique dialect here called Chinglish. And please, when panelists want to respond to the issues that are in discussion, please raise your right hand. If you want to talk on a new subject, your left hand, please. Okay, so Audrey, can you please start?
Hello. First of all, thank you all very much for having me on Valentine's Day. The topic for today is democracy for Hong Kong. So we ought to ask, what really is democracy? Abraham Lincoln said it's government by the people, of the people, for the people. But here in Hong Kong, we are told that this is a Western concept. This is the one country. So even for democracy, we've got to have democracy with Chinese characteristics. I listened with great interest to all that Professor said. We have all those problems, of course, but we have one major problem before all those other problems you spoke about. I first of all have to apologize to Jasper because I'm going to say something about his party, Democratic Alliance for the Betterment of Hong Kong. It's DAB for short. And Martin Lee always says that that stands for democracy according to Beijing. Joking apart, it actually is the crux of the matter. Because some people in Hong Kong and in Beijing, of course, generally believe that when we talk about democracy in Hong Kong, it's got to be in accordance with Beijing. But it's actually quite ironical because democracy, we all know, comes from the Greek word, means people's rule, and even in Chinese, manju, that also means people's rule. So it's ironic, it's a contradiction in terms when we consider our electoral system for democracy. We've got to ask ourselves, well, what do our rulers think? What do those in power think? How are they going to design the system for us? Rather than, well, what do the people in Hong Kong want? What is suitable for Hong Kong? Of course I know we don't start with a clean slate. Of course I know we have the basic law. Our chairman, moderator, read out Article 45 of the basic law. It talks about a broadly representative nominating system, nominating committee, in accordance with democratic procedures. What is broadly representative? Of course, there can be a range, but you can also have things beyond the range. The chairman just now said, well, nominating committee is broadly representative because it has 4 sectors, and it stands for all the walks of life in Hong Kong. I'm sorry, I can't agree with that. We're told that the nominating committee, its number of persons, its formation, its structure, its composition, must be in accordance with the election committee. And we know how the election committee is formed. And we also know the electoral basis for the election committee. We have 3.3 million registered voters in Hong Kong. And the elections committee, and therefore the future nominating committee, is only going to be comprised of 1,200 members. And if you take away the very few directly elected legislators and district council members, what you really have what you left, the overwhelming majority of the 1,200 election committee is elected from about 7% of the electorate. Single digit, 7%. There is no way you call that broadly representative. So when you say the system we are going to have in Hong Kong, this nominating committee, which is going to choose our candidates, when you say this is broadly representative in accordance with the Basic Law, I'm sorry, that's living a lie. And you're basically forcing a lie on Hong Kong people when you say, well, pocket it first, because it's going to go better. It's not. Because in fact, not just the Basic Law, we also have the MPC decision last year, in August last year. And that practically did an interpretation of the Basic Law for us. Because it says, well, the nominating committee has to follow or has to be in accordance with the election committee because the election committee is defined as broadly representative. So there you are. And also, it practically defined what is in accordance with democratic procedures because it says, well, whoever is going to be the candidate must get the endorsement or the nomination of more than half of the election committee. Well, that, as Professor Carey very politely implied, it's not going to be inclusive because that's really basically a one-party nomination. And then, of course, there's the other straitjacket. You can only have 2 to 3 candidates, no more. And so, Professor, you nearly brought tears to my eyes when you said just now that when you go into the ballot box, you see 12 to 20 names on the ballot paper. I mean, it's something that in Hong Kong we can't even dream of. Because that's the MPC decision we're told we have to live with. And there is no way we're going to change it in Hong Kong. Well, if that is not going to be changed, what other maneuvers, what other electoral system can we talk of? Because we don't even begin to talk about the parliamentary system, hybrid system, presidential system, single member or multi-member or whatever it is. Because we don't even get started at the gate. I mean, it's like a horse race. Your horse is kept within the gates and you can't even start running. Can't even join the race. And I know the chairman's going to cut me short, so I'm going to be very quick.
Yes. You've already overrun your time.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I'm just going to say that the script is written for us, that because this is so unacceptable to the Democrats, that proposal is going to be vetoed, and the government and the central authorities is going to blame the Democrats for taking away the one person, one vote for the rest of Hong Kong. But, I mean, you look at what happened last week at Tuen Mun, at the shopping centre. Things like that is going to happen even more. Things are going to get uglier. So I'm afraid the script is not going to work. Yeah, I will stop here because you're going to get impatient.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, Audrey has pointed out some problems, but the thing is, we were actually going through all those discussions during the drafting of the Basic Law in the 80s. I was very heavily involved into it, and at that time, we Hong Kong people thought we knew all about democracy, but now looking back, we were so naive. Anyway, WK.
Thank you, Vincent. The script might have been written for us, but the players can still make it a lively play. That's my first point. But anyway, I'm not going to rehearse all the very conventional and very well-known arguments in Hong Kong. I would like to make just 3 points. First point is that democracy came very late in this city, but freedom has been with us for more than a century. So the quest for freedom is within our DNA, and that explains why so many people in Hong Kong want democracy, because they think democracy is the only system that can guarantee a sustainable freedom. So that's fully understandable. There's no need to debate about that. The way is how to go about it. Now here comes my second point. I'm not an academic, and I'm very poor in theorizing concepts. And I try to learn from real-life examples. I think the road to democracy, Professor, is littered with failed states and futile attempts. But there are notable successful examples. When I was in the States, I followed a professor who focused on studying Spain. And Spain's democratization process between 1975, when the military dictator Franco died, and the state becoming a full liberal democracy only took 5 years, to the amazement of all observers in the world, and to the big amazement of even the Spanish people themselves. Now, I won't have time to go into all that, but 2 points stand out in this process. And by the way, a lot of Spanish people then, in the mid-70s, expected another bloodshed before they can settle the controversy between the left and the right, between the army and the Democrats. But no, very, very little blood was shed. 2 reasons for their success. One is the nation has a broad agreement that the country in the 70s could not be ruled by a dictatorship regime because the country was already in a modern, complex economic model, and the people, the populace was so well educated that the country has got to move on. So from left to the right, they all agree, after Franco, the country has to move on. There was this broad consensus. Actually, this consensus is now in Hong Kong. We've got to move on. The second, even more important point is that they have positive players from the extreme Communist Party to the right-wing army. People grumbled, people fought on the streets, people demonstrated, people argued within closed-door chambers among cigars and cigarettes. But the dominant players, at the end of the day, they told a positive line. They compromised along the way. They know they could not get it right on the first election, but they said, let's have a first election. Let's compromise. Don't poke the military. Don't provoke them into another intervention. Get them along. Legalize the Communist Party so that they could join the game properly. Don't leave them out on the field, bringing the 2 extremes back to the game, and that make it successful. The third point I would like to make is, like it or not, I know a lot of the Pan-Democrats don't like it. We are not an independent polity. We are an autonomous region under the sovereign governance of the Central People's Government, and that is the reality. And when the Central People's Government judge how far they can allow us to go into this democracy road, they look not just at this city, not just at how this city is governed, they look at the reflections and the sort of implications onto the whole nation. So you've got to understand this particular point of view and be realistic about it. My point is that, okay, you may not like it, but please join the game. Because say, I take a very theoretical example, Audrey, if you join the game, if you get into the nominating committee stage, you probably, with your grace and elegance, you can beat a lot of the nominees from the other side and came out on top of the list in opinion poll, and then you can see how the nominating committee acts. Test them. Play the game and test them. If you don't play the game, you will never be able to test the fairness of the system. Okay, I'll stop at that, Chairman.
Thank you, WK. I think WK make a very important point that we should not be really just testing out our democracy because Hong Kong is not a sovereign state. We can't afford to fail. So I think that's something we should bear in mind. But also another point, I've been a member of the election committee since '97. I was never have to really abide by any rules to vote. I always vote on my own conscience. And in the future, it's going to be the same, even for the nominating committee. Anyway, Professor Ming, Sing.
Thank you. My topic is clamp down on democracy, broken constitutional promises. It seems these broken promises sustain protests and may trigger a lose-lose game. Okay. Now, the NPC's model has been widely criticized as having violated the Basic Law because of the overly restrictive nomination. And then it has been a consensus of at least 4, one of them is sitting here, 4 former chairs of the Hong Kong Bar Association, as well as some internationally renowned experts, that ICCPR should be applied to Hong Kong in defining universal suffrage. And then there's no way that the NPC's model proposed has followed the ICCPR, okay? Including, the statement made by the chair of the last Bar Association that just stepped down last month. I don't think I need to read this because I'm running short of time, okay? So that's why I think the baseline of Beijing is very clear. No real democracy. Beijing is going to exert absolute control. It has broken the promises made in the Basic Law and irreversibly eroded Hong Kong people's trust. And it made discussion, in my opinion, of constitutional models of democracy of little or of no relevance. And that's one of the leaders in the field of comparative democracy, Larry Diamond, said. The decision of the NPC and Beijing is equal to lifting a giant middle finger in the face of the pro-democracy forces in Hong Kong. The broken promises go further. The white paper just published in June of last year. It also violated the Basic Law in a very blunt manner by saying that Beijing has the right to meddle with Hong Kong's all kinds of domestic affairs, not necessarily confined to this defense and diplomacy. And that the judges should be patriotic as defined by the top Beijing leaders. So these breaking of constitutional promises actually have created a large degree of uncertainty for Hong Kong's future. People, some of them are ready to exit. According to a poll done by the Chinese Shui, released in early September, 21% they were considering to emigrate. After the umbrella movement, within the so-called self-described pan-democrats, more than 30% of the citizens, they are considering to emigrate. But then the others are considering to fight, okay? So the question I'm going to ask by referring to a number of surveys done by 3 universities, how sustainable are those protests? And if so, if they are sustainable, what will be the consequence on Hong Kong? Now, first of all, there's no solid evidence that the umbrella movement has been mainly funded or driven by foreign powers, and it's far from an unruly mob. Over 75% of them have had post-secondary school education. They were polite, mutually helpful, and creative most of the time, okay? And then between 1.2 and 1.3 million of Hong Kong citizens joined this law-breaking movement, which is actually the largest and longest civil disobedience act in Hong Kong history, so we cannot ignore its function. Its implication. And it did not only consist of students. There were 48% of white-collar workers, more than 40% were managers, professionals, and associate professionals, okay? These people, these people were naive people. And then the protesters have been very loyal and highly committed. Over 60% of them, they've stayed for at least 15 days, okay? And then, according to this poll done by the OpenU, some of the reasons that I circled in red are very revealing. The top one reason for them to join this movement was to demand genuine universal suffrage. And then the other 2 reasons I'd like to draw attention to is about 46% agree that they agree with the concept of civil disobedience, and then the other 33% they try to resist Beijing's intervention into Hong Kong. And these things are going to be repeated should Beijing continue to intervene with Hong Kong, and should Beijing restrain itself from giving Hong Kong true democracy. So the protest may be sustained by the simple effort of Beijing. And my own research done through the Chinese Shui, through a Hong Kong-wide telephone survey, to a certain extent confirm the points raised by mentioned by the OpenU. These are the factors found in my survey after using multivariate regression. I find that having considered 20 factors at least, these stand out as relatively important. Number 1, post-materialism. Number 2, the support for real democracy. Number 3, a low trust towards the CCP. Number 4, a widely perceived erosion of core values, including press freedom and the rule of law. And number 5, perceived government's poor handling of mainland Hong Kong conflicts. Tuen Mun is one of the cases. And then the rising of Hong Kong identity. And then the perceived severe social inequality and the younger generation. These factors will they explain why people support the umbrella movement. This diagram shows the post-materialism, and I find that there's been a gradually rising trend we now have 20% on the top right-hand corner, sorry. Top right-hand corner as regarded as post-materialists, okay? So these people are not going to be bought or purchased by economic pie. They want instead human rights and increased capacity to shape government's policy making, okay? So these people are going to form the backrock for joining some protests. And then support for democracy, which were in turn affected by the perceived severe income inequality, the satisfaction towards Hong Kong's HKSAR government's handling of mainland Hong Kong tensions, and the worry about the erosion of core values, including the rule of law. Okay? And these worry, actually, they have been well grounded in reality of what unfolded in the last few years, if not after the 1997. That is the first one, press freedom. Just 3 days ago, we hit an all-time low in the last 15 years, not 14 years, in terms of the press freedom, according to the international NGO, the Reporters Without Borders, okay? And then we also hit a very high degree of tension with regard to the mainland Hong Kong tension, you know. Despite the fact that Hong Kong has now become the top #1 city throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of population density, the travelers from mainland who will come as individual travelers will rise to, expected by the government, 100 million in 9 years' time. And the government said the policy is okay, despite widespread criticism. More than half of the people actually, according to a CHK survey last year, already said that the individual travelers have brought more harm than good to Hong Kong, okay? And then the strengthening of a Hong Kong identity is also worrying, okay? As I said, in my survey, after controlling 20 factors, Hong Kong identity would tend to be more supportive for the protests. And the policies done by Hong Kong government seem to be strengthening that kind of identity and giving itself trouble, okay? Inequality, I've got too many diagrams to show. This is just one snapshot. We were the worst as, in 2007 already among the rich countries, as measured in the standard measurement of Gini coefficient, okay? And then another thing is the trust towards the central government. We were more or less near an all-time low. Not as low as 1992, but we were close, okay, according to the Hong Kong News poll. And then some people may think, towards the end of the movement, about 70% of the Hong Kong population agreed on the retreat of the occupiers from the occupied sites. But let's not forget, when we look at the same data from the CHK survey, the School of Journalism who did 4 surveys from September to December, there was a consistent level of support of more than 30% of them, supporting the umbrella movement, okay, even in October, November, and December, okay. So these form a bedrock of supporting the protesters, the civil disobedience. And then one is also worrying that if you look at the curve from 2001 to 2012, partly because of the social, structural, cultural factors I mentioned. When you look at the graph, that has been a rising trend of conflicts. Number of social demonstrations, public meeting, processions recorded by the police. I got another update data, but I didn't have time. And the number was rising further into 2013, okay? So are we going to end up in a lose-lose game? It could be. Now, if Beijing and Hong Kong SAR governments continue to stick to the hardline policies toward Hong Kong, which embody the following elements: the erosion of core values, including press freedom. Perhaps the next casualty is academic freedom. The expansion in the individual travel scheme, the poor handling of mainland Hong Kong conflicts, inability to address huge income inequality, and then the continued suppression of real democracy. These measures may induce more protests and even civil disobedient acts for democracy in future. And Moody is not alone. Okay? Moody, the international rating agency, has already issued warnings twice that should Beijing remain intransigent as far as our democracy is concerned, it might trigger rising political instability and ultimately dampen its rating on Hong Kong, which will be bad for both Hong Kong and China. Okay? That's why I saw a lose-lose game. Finally, in response to Mr. Lam, okay, urging us to consider pocketing NPC's model, I think this is a risky non-starter. Okay, this is my final slide. And number one, okay, this suggestion does not have any contain any credible progress in terms of democratization. So far, we haven't heard any single top Beijing official making very concrete promise that if Hong Kong people are willing to pocket this NPC's model now, okay, then Beijing will make a large-scale concession in the next round of city election or in the very near future, okay? And even if such officials come out and make such promise, how credible are they, given the fact that Beijing has lied again and again in the last 30 years with regard to democratization of Hong Kong? And thirdly, Beijing recently, it seemed, through our secretary responsible for constitutional affairs, Tam Ji-yun, also rejected the full demolition of functional constituencies in 2020, which again constitutes a violation of the promise. Okay? On the other hand, pocketing it may also incur huge costs in terms of democratization. Number one, it might heighten implicitly the electoral legitimacy for the future CE, and Beijing may be encouraged to push the CE to impose some draconian laws, including Article 23, but not confined to Article 23. Okay? And secondly, it might also decrease pressure for Beijing to truly democratize Hong Kong. People may ask, how much bargaining power do we have? We do, okay, but let me share with you later in the forum. And finally, another cause that I did not mention here, should some pan-Democrats split with the rank and vote for this NPC's model, that the further split within the pan-democratic camp would also emasculate, weaken further our democracy movement and dim further the prospect of real democratization. So the costs are very huge. Thank you.
With Professor Ming's presentation, you can see how democratic we are. I'm totally in opposition to his views. But anyway, I have a couple of issues that I want to raise. You know, the umbrella movement, I can see it from my office every day. It's so well organized and it costs so much money. Who is actually involved in funding that? And then also, a core value for Hong Kong is the rule of law. Why would our very prominent citizens be talking about, you know, 公民抗命? So anyway, let's Jasper, please.
Okay. So what do we do now? So Hong Kong people, well, many Hong Kong people, according to Professor Singh, are getting more and more angry with Beijing, more and more distrustful. And if Beijing continues in its intransigence against wishes of Hong Kong people, we're going to see more massive, angry uprisings. This is what professors' surveys tell us. Well, if we are able to carry out a survey in Beijing, a survey among the Chinese officials who are involved in Hong Kong affairs, I think this trend towards a very negative attitude towards the other side is very much reciprocated. The Chinese officials are becoming more and more angry with Hong Kong people. They are having less and less confidence in allowing Hong Kong people to govern Hong Kong properly. And they would think if Hong Kong people continue in their intransigence against the policies of the central government, then they're going to cram down even more harshly. So what do we do? So we have any kind of election method the central government is willing to allow in Hong Kong is rejected by Hong Kong people, or by many Hong Kong people. And the only kind of election method Hong Kong people want is not allowed by Beijing. So what do we do? So what do we do? What options do we have? What options do we have? Well, let us be frank. The controversy about these election method, or more specifically, the nomination method for the election of chief executive in 2017 is all about whether the central government is going to allow Hong Kong people to choose their own head of government on their own. And my friends from the pan-democratic camp, there are quite a few, say that Beijing is breaking all her promises because China promised Hong Kong universal suffrage for electing the chief executive. And now the August 31st decision of the NPCSC is throwing away that promise. Now, we have to be fair. I mean, Vincent said he went through the process of the drafting the basic law and the consultation exercises. Then I did the same, right? And I also had the privilege of listening to some of the senior Chinese officials back in the early 1990s explaining their intentions, the intentions behind the drafting of the basic law, especially that chapter on government system. But then, of course, Professor Carey told us, sometimes systems do not work in the way they're intended. Right? Well, to me, it has always been clear that the central government must have a part to play in deciding who the chief executive in Hong Kong shall be, even after we have reached the final goal of universal suffrage. Compare Article 45, which Vincent has read out, with Article 68. Article 68 says the ultimate goal for the evolution of the method of forming the Legislative Council is eventually all the seats in the LegCo shall be elected by universal suffrage, full stop. That's it. Now, in Article 45, there's this very specific mention of the nomination committee. Why isn't Article 45 worded in the same way as 68? Why not simply say the eventual goal of the development of the method of election, of choosing the chief executive, is election of the chief executive by universal suffrage, full stop? Why take the trouble of putting in this formation of the nomination committee? Now, to me, it has always been clear, because right at the start, the Beijing officials told us, we want to have a say in the choice of chief executive. Sure enough, even after the election in Hong Kong, the elected person still has to be appointed by the central government. But then it very soon became obvious that if the central government were to veto, were to reject someone elected by universal suffrage in Hong Kong, we would have a very serious political crisis. And so the intention, the purpose of having this nomination process the nomination committee deciding who the candidates can be is exactly to avoid this kind of crisis. Just make sure that no one running in the race can be unacceptable to the central government. That's it. Now, this is what the system is designed for. Now, if we don't want it, what do we do? WK has suggested, let us take it first. Let us see how one reason, Professor, why I think sometimes the system cannot work in the way it was designed for is because of politics. The politics at the time does not allow the system to work in the way it was intended for. We cannot guarantee our democracy simply by designing a perfect system, if there is any at all. However, if Hong Kong people, if we have faith in Hong Kong people, if we believe in Hong Kong people, I believe Hong Kong people can make the system work in a way as democratic as possible. And this is why. But this should not come as a surprise to you. I agree with WK. Right? If not, what do we do? What other options do we have? So how do we fight? Right? You tell the central government, look, Hong Kong will be in for big trouble if we don't have true democracy in 2017, because you're going to see a lot of very angry, massive uprisings in Hong Kong. Well, their response would be, yes, that is why we have to clamp down more firmly. All right? All the more, it makes it all the more necessary for us to have someone we can trust completely to take up the post of chief executive. Right? How can we allow Hong Kong people to choose their own head of government? That's it. I'm sorry, I don't have any answer.
Thank you, Jasper. I think it's important that you highlight the one country issue for Hong Kong. Now, I'm going to ask the professor to take a 30,000 feet high view on all these views and discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, there were so many points that were made, I think, that were absolutely on target in the last 20 minutes or so. And I want to just follow up on a theme that I think was consistent across many of them. One is WK, I believe, had observed entirely correctly that history is littered with examples of failed transitions to democracy. And we talk, very frequently about the successful cases, but the unsuccessful cases far outnumber the successful cases, which is not a particularly optimistic note on which to start my comments, but I think it's important to acknowledge. And you mentioned the Spanish transition, and the fact that Spanish history at the time in the 1970s provided abundant reasons for distrust. It had been a violent and repressive history in politics of the 20th century in Spain. And yet, somehow, members from the opposing camps managed to agree to a transition that everybody understood was not going to happen overnight, that was going to take some time. And yet, the different sides realized that they stood to gain more by adopting some kind of a posture of mutual trust than they did if they were to remain in intransigent positions. That's one of the few success cases. And the other cases as well, some of the other cases that come to mind that I think of as relatively successful or more successful than we may have thought initially have that same characteristic. South Africa in the early 1990s with the transition away from apartheid. The Chilean case that I spoke about earlier in the late 1980s and early 1990s, in every one of these cases, the political opposition confronted a dilemma, which was, do we participate in these elections now? Because in doing so, we basically confer on the elections, to use a term I rejected a half an hour ago, a legitimacy. If we participate, we acknowledge that these rules are worth participating in, even though we recognize we don't like the rules, we're never going to be satisfied with the rules. We have confidence that if not 5 years down the road, then 10 years, then 15 years down the road, we'll be better off for having participated now. And in Chile, the opposition to Pinochet had an anguished and explicit debate about exactly this question because they hated the rules that they knew they were going to be inheriting even if they won the election. And they knew that it was going to be a process of 15 or 20 or 25 years to be able to reform those rules even if they won. But they made that bet in 1988 and again in 1990, and I think most of them would look back today and say that was the right bet to make. So the question then in these situations always becomes, how can there be a credible commitment to subsequent reforms or to the opportunity for subsequent reforms, if not this year, then 5 years down the line, or 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line. And usually that kind of a commitment moves into technical areas as opposed to the kinds of claims that have much resonance on the street at a particular moment, which is to say, oftentimes the opportunities for subsequent reform are in the fine print. And there are two areas that I would actually ask about. I would ask my colleagues on this panel to comment on. The basic law seems pretty unambiguous that the candidates for chief executive are going to be nominated through a nominating committee. And the debate then is over what does it mean for that nominating committee to be broadly representative. And maybe there's some opportunity for movement there. So here are the two areas of fine print that I would want to ask about. One is the composition of the nominating committee itself. It may be that there is no room for negotiation over the composition for a nominating committee for 2017. Well, what about 2022? What about 2027 and subsequently? Again, my knowledge of Hong Kong politics is very recent and I'm afraid very superficial, but the subsectors, the composition of the subsectors or the relative share of nominating committee seats that are occupied by subsector representatives seems to be something on which there could be room for future reform and future change. And then the second element of the fine print that I think also could be open for future reform would be the threshold for nomination. It's an unusual system in which anyone, in order to get onto the general election ballot, must have majority support in any committee. That's unusual in comparative perspective. Is that an absolute fixed, rock-solid threshold? If that could be reduced in subsequent elections, and if the commitment to that could be credible even to the opposition, then it seems that there would be a belief that if not in 2017, then in 22, then in 2027, there may be room for a process that changes. I don't know what the prospects are for a credible commitment. I know there's skepticism about credibility, but that's always the case in democratic transitions.
The threshold was 12.5% last time, not 50%. So we've gone backwards.
That's a big difference. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Well, let me throw the first question to the panel. How important is it to have the election of the chief executive by universal franchise in 2017? WK, as convener of the Executive Council, I think you're probably in the best position to comment on this.
I think it's very clear that most Hong Kong people want it. It's very clear from polls to polls. We want to move on. We know the governability. Professor, you mentioned this as a very important point. Governability is now in question because of the stalemate between executive and the legislature. we probably are better than Washington in the sense that we have this chance and we don't seize it and we lose it, then I think the stalemate is going to get worse and governability becomes a big question mark. I know many, many people in Hong Kong do not agree to the present proposed model as the model they want. Many of them see it as a bad model. But whatever way you see it, it is a model. However small a step, it is a step. And change doesn't necessarily just depend on words or even in black and white. It depends on action, depends on the people's action. And here I come back to the President, Yok-sing's will. We must have faith in the people of Hong Kong. As pan-democrats, how can you not have faith in the people of Hong Kong? Hong Kong people are very pragmatic. Most of them know what they are doing. And polls after polls, more than half or at least close to half of the people tell everybody that they might have different views, but they want to move this step. So here we are. I think a large percentage of Hong Kong people have actually spoken.
Yok-sing.
Can I respond to Professor Carey's questions? I think Audrey was right when she said the Standing Committee of National People's Congress interpreted the Basic Law when it made the decision last August. The Basic Law simply says the nominating committee shall be broadly representative, and also the process of nomination shall be democratic, right? Now, Professor, you're right when you pointed out that these concepts are actually up to interpretation. Now, within the Chinese constitutional system, the NPCSC has the power to interpret law, including the Basic Law. So the interpretation of the NPCSC is legally binding. It has legal authority. However, it does not belong to the same level as the Basic Law itself. So if we want to change, if we want to amend that clause in Basic Law, it will be very difficult. But as I understand it, the NPCSC can decide to reinterpret that clause in another way in due course. I mean, so this is entirely possible, first of all, including the threshold you mentioned. And about the threshold, I think to put records straight, I don't think it is fair to say that this 50% threshold is, a retrogression, a step backward from what we had last time, because we are not comparing the same thing. If we are talking of the initial threshold, if you want yourself, if someone wants to join the race, first of all, you have to present yourself in front of the 1,200-member committee. Now, it is called the election committee now. If we succeed in bringing in a new system, it will be the nomination committee. It will be the same body, or similarly constituted, a 1,200-member committee. Now, last time, the threshold for the in-gate, in order to present yourself in front of the 1,200 members, was 1/8. That is 12.5%, right? But the 1,200 member chose one from all the so-called candidates without any Hong Kong people participating, and the threshold for that, I call that the out-gate, is 50%. Make no mistake. That is why Mr. C.Y. Leung had to have at least 600 votes in order to get elected, right? So it was also 50%, but for that 50%, only one person could go through the out-gate. And that person would be appointed by the central government. Now, if we succeed in bringing in the new system, what the NPCSC decision said is only about the outgate. In order to go out of the 1,200 member committee, everyone will have to have the support of at least 1/2 of the members. But then they will have to choose 2 or 3. And then the Hong Kong people ultimately will decide among these 2 or 3 who will be the final winner. Now, the NPCSC decision is entirely silent on what's going to happen in the in-gate. And the central government officials actually suggested that the threshold for that can be as low as the threshold for last time, even lower, right? So I believe what is very important is first this initial threshold, and also after going over this initial threshold, what can those prospective candidates do, right? If it is going to be a very close business, after getting the suggested names, then the 1,200 people simply met in a closed room and then come out after a couple of hours and say, look, among those 8 prospective candidates, we have chosen these 2, Yok-sing and Dixon, right? Now, that of course would be a big step backward. But what about this? If after this initial crossing of the threshold, all those prospective candidates can go to the public, can meet the public, they can go on television debates, right? They can at once start their election campaign and let the Hong Kong people choose. Then we can say, if we have someone as popular as Audrey, right, enjoying very high popularity ratings throughout the campaign, and simply because Beijing says, no, we don't want her, and then the nomination committee refuses to allow her in, what will Hong Kong people do? How will they react? What will happen on election day? I don't think we need the kind of a blank vote mechanism proposed by Professor Albert Chan, right? To make the election invalid. We don't even need that. China, if the central government takes all this trouble to introduce this election, popular election in Hong Kong, they don't want the whole world to look at it and say, look, this is sham democracy. They don't want it to become the laughing stock of the international community. No, they don't. So I believe it is still within the hands of Hong Kong people to make it work. So, sorry.
No, thank you. Audrey, please think about what issues and questions you want to put to the panel. Audrey.
I must come back to WK because he said, trust the Hong Kong people. I can't leave that unanswered. I want to state for the record very clearly, I trust the Hong Kong people. But we are not here talking about trusting Hong Kong people. We're talking about putting our trust in 601 election nominating committee members, because when you have a nominating committee of 1,200 and you need a majority to get through the outgate, you are putting your trust in 601 members of the nominating committee. I also want to come back to what Jasper said. He said, well, what do we do? It's almost as if the obstacle is with the Pan-Democrats because they are standing in the way of Hong Kong people getting one person, one vote. Actually, the obstacle is not with the Pan-Democrats. As I said earlier, and I don't mean to offend Jasper's party when I make this joke, but that is the problem. Hong Kong is facing a choice of whether we have democracy according to Beijing, DAB, or not having democracy at all. And therefore, the problem is really not that the Pan-Democrats refuse to have one person, one vote. But what we really do want is for those people who think that democracy can only be at Beijing's pleasure, that they start talking to Beijing, because the problem is not with the Hong Kong people. The problem is with the system you are forcing down our throat, which is not democracy, which does not meet the minimum standard, let alone a perfect system, which does not meet the minimum standard of ICCPR and the minimum requirement for a democratic system. Can I also mention one point? When Jasper Zhang said, what can we do? And I'm grateful to him for saying he agrees with me when I said that the decision in August practically redefined or interpreted Article 45, the Basic Law, in accordance with democratic procedures, means having the endorsement of the majority or more than half of the nominating committee. There is a solution, because under the Chinese constitution, the PRC constitution, Article 62, Rule 11, it actually says that the MPC can change and revoke or withdraw the decision of the MPC Standing Committee. So far, we only have the decision of the Standing Committee. So, I mean, if DAB, if all those who believe in democracy according to Beijing can stand on the side of Hong Kong people and believe in Hong Kong people and get Beijing or MPC to change, then I think it's going to work.
Yeah. All right, Ming.
Several points. One, at least one poll, if not more than one, has indicated that there was a relative majority supporting the vetoing of the MPC's model several months ago. So if Pan-Democrats or other NGOs get more efforts to explain the pitfall of pocketing MPC's model, the current polling results may change again. Secondly, I think, let's be honest, many analysts argue that Xi Jinping perhaps was the most powerful dictator during PRC's rule only after Chairman Mao. Okay? He has concentrated so much power in his hands. He has strangled so much the civil society and suppressed so much freedom in China. So it's simply unlikely, it's simply not realistic that the nomination committee, which can be controlled by Beijing, that Xi Jinping would allow a widely popular leader in Hong Kong to be elected through this so-called MPC's model of universal suffrage. So should that occur, which is very likely that it will occur, I don't see that there will be an end in sight for the governance problems that we have been suffering since the hangover. Number one, crony capitalism. It was ranked number one by economists for 2 surveys. And number two, press freedom, I just quoted. The threat to the rule of law, the inequality that I mentioned, and the social mobility, okay, which is also notorious, very notorious, much worse than we're worse than United States and United Kingdom. The level of corruption, according to the World Bank, according to the Transparency International, we have gone to an all-time low in the last 8 years. Okay, all these can be somehow directly or indirectly traced back to our crippling semi-authoritarian system. And I think this is some of the features of this system which are not working is that if Beijing can only trust a few select group of people, or a few minority, and then it so happens that many capable people in Hong Kong, they're excluded from that group. Then how can you make this complex society work? Okay, so as simple as that. So it's not true that we lack the talents, but it's only the truism to say that many talents are not regarded by Beijing as loyal enough. Okay, so this is a kind of fundamental clash that we are faced with, and I think the outlet is not to pocket the MPC's model, but rather to keep on a kind of wisely, okay, the liberalization and democracy movement. Otherwise, we might bear the huge cost that I mentioned in my last PowerPoint. Thank you.
Okay, we're now open to the floor. There's a few hands up, so please, you're the first one. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Ricky.
And also whom you want to address the question to.
So I guess whoever interested can answer the question. Actually, I just got a call from a friend last night, who is a lady, who is not 5 years old, asked me about for opinion. So she said that she found out that her husband, start cheating every single week. Okay, so she is upset, she is angry, she argue, she debate. So eventually her husband proposed that, okay, how about I only start cheating only once a month instead of once a week? But you have to sign a document saying that you agree with this proposal. And somehow he also said the same thing as Woon-kwong said, that like, however small this step is, it is still a step. So my friend asked me for opinion whether she should or should not sign it. Can I have a pop book here, like who think they should sign the document? Who think the wife should sign the document? So I get, okay, that's fine. Who think they should not sign the document? Thank you. So I actually told my friend, okay, if you sign the document, on the number, it seems better because, once a week versus once a month, but by the nature, is it different? Is it any different? Is it any better? And even worse, once you sign the document, later when you divorce, you take the document to the judge, to the court. The judge say, okay, dear lady, you agree that your husband cheating. What are you fighting for? Is this fair? So I want to give back this question to the panelists, like, whoever wants to answer can answer. Should my friend accept this proposal? Thank you.
I'm not going to argue that Beijing is not cheating, nor am I to give any advice on whether Hong Kong should sign any document or not. I only want to remind you, Hong Kong is not the wife of Beijing.
Okay. Okay, David, you raised your hand earlier, so.
David Zweig from HKUST. My question is largely towards Deng Yok-sing. The scenario that you portrayed by which Audrey could get elected, okay? I think it's interesting, right? Because it shows the loopholes in some ways. It works off the loopholes or the opportunities that exist within the proposal. I actually think that they should take the step, but that's separate. But the view that you portray, how realistic is it that in fact that's going to be an outcome? Because largely my own view is that the reason that the 50%, I mean, you didn't like the 50% threshold, would be my guess. You told them not to take that, to make it 50%. I know a lot of people who have been consulted in Hong Kong by various organizations representing the central government, all told them basically, unless they were on the very conservative side, said don't do 50%. You do 50%, you're going to get Occupy Central, right? And they did 50% and they got Occupy Central. Right? So my own question is, how realistic is it? Because I actually believe that she's the reason that there's 50%.
I believe the the most important purpose of the August 31st decision by the NPCSC is not, as many people have suggested, not to make sure that someone Beijing likes very much can be elected. The purpose of the decision is to make sure that no one Beijing doesn't really want to become the chief executive can take part in the race. And since the debate began on this 2017 election, Chinese officials, high-ranking Chinese officials, have said more than once that they believe that the pan-Democrats, or most of the pan-Democrats, are patriotic. That means it is not their purpose to shut out all the pan-Democrats. Because they are pan-Democrats, so they cannot take part in the race. Now, what I envisage is, say if we have this really low threshold for the in gate, so definitely there will be 1 or 2 Pan-Democrats coming in. Now, during the campaign period, these personalities, they do not only have to appeal to the 1,200 nomination committee members, they appeal to the Hong Kong public as a whole, right? They talk to the Hong Kong people. At the same time, which is equally important, they're talking to Beijing. The central government will be there watching. And certainly, DAB members who believe democracy in Hong Kong can only be in accordance with Beijing, will ask Audrey, if Audrey stands, are you going to raise this question of,結束一黨專政? Huh? Putting an end to this one-party rule, one-party dictatorship in China, right? When you receive your nomination certificate from the central government, what are you going to say? Are you going to go to the June 4th gatherings every year if you become the chief executive? And she or anyone from the Pan-Democrats will have to answer these questions. And then Beijing will listen. All the Hong Kong people will listen. And then they will judge. And then the central government will judge. Well, at the end of it all, if Audrey turns out to be the most popular candidate or prospective candidate, head and shoulders above all the others, then Beijing will have to weigh, if we keep her out, what the consequences will be. On the other hand, if we let her in, well, we have listened to what she said during the whole campaign. Can we trust her? Can we cooperate with her? Right? You're shaking your head. I don't see that. I don't see that as. I believe that any serious contender for the post of chief executive must clearly know he or she must have the blessing of the central government, right? I don't think my friend Long Hair told me he will certainly stand in the chief executive election, right? To make a mockery of everything, to expose to the whole world how false it is, how bad the system is. I mean, any serious contender for the post will not go that way.
But if, my sense is that if the idea was, if there wasn't the strong sense to stop someone like Audrey from getting in there, then why not just make it 15% right off the bat? Why make it 50%? For the nomination committee. I mean, the whole, you said yourself that Beijing wants to avoid the embarrassment of declining the opportunity for someone to become chief executive that they don't like. And I think that's why they put it in the 50%. I understand that, right? And, yes. and I understand that process, but then how could why would a scenario then work out that would then still create that situation? So why do you think that, in fact, as the process works out, it's going to be as open as you suggest? I just don't think it will be.
Well, make no mistake. I'm not saying it would definitely work out that way. I'm saying there is still a choice. I mean, it is up to the central government to decide. If they are still very adamant in not allowing someone from the Pan-Democrats becoming the chief executive, then of course, that's it. I mean, they will have to face the political consequences of that. They will have to face the very obvious consequence that the election, the whole election, will lose a lot of its credibility, right? They will have to face that. But then, I believe they will balance. Is it too high a price to pay to accept, to allow someone from the Pan-Democrats to run?
Okay, we better move on.
Sorry.
There's so many hands, so I think you've raised your hand earlier. and then it's you, and over here, okay.
Thank you very much. This question is for Professor Carey. I'm Harry Harding, also of UST. This is a question for Professor Carey to put in comparative perspective a very important point the Council President Jasper TSANG made a few minutes ago. In how many countries is there a situation where a head of government, however selected, has to be confirmed or appointed by a head of state or some other higher authority? And what is the spectrum from purely ceremonial on the one hand to the substantive power, which if I understand Beijing's position correctly, Beijing has in the case of Hong Kong?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the tradition, I suppose, of a head of government needing to be confirmed or accepted by a head of state comes from traditionally from the monarchical systems, constitutional monarchies, European monarchies that transitioned into constitutional monarchies during the 19th and 20th century. And gradually over that period of time, I think usually through informal norms, the expectation that the monarch would actually exercise discretion receded. So, of course, technically, I will defer to my other people in the room from the United Kingdom, but I believe it's still technically the case that the Prime Minister is presented to the Queen, and the Queen must accept the Prime Minister. I don't think anyone in the UK expects that any regent would reject a Prime Minister selected by Commons at this point. The monarchy would be in more jeopardy than the government. So the more interesting cases currently actually exist in these hybrid systems that have been created. So these hybrid, what I've called, premier presidential systems, there's various words for them, in which there's a directly elected president as well as a head of government who's chosen and depends on assembly support. And in these cases, there's been a need to write explicitly into the Constitution step by step what those procedures for presentation and acceptance look like. And I think I'll rely on the Polish case, which I think is, I think I can get it right, but there's a series of reduced thresholds over time so that there will be a government presented to the president that the president can reject and send back to the Sejm, to the Polish Legislative Assembly, with a counter proposal. And with that counter proposal, initially there's a relatively high threshold for acceptance. I think it might be 2/3 in the Sejm. If the Sejm does not accept it, they can send a second government back to the president, and the president then must either accept or reject and can send back to the Sejm with a lower threshold. So eventually there's an effort to reach a broad consensus, and over time, if the proposals and counter proposals are not mutually acceptable, the threshold reduces. It never goes below a majority. And I've seen that in a variety of these hybrid constitutions. So there's usually what happens is over time, if a broad consensus can't be reached, we lower the threshold for consensus.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you for most passionate and thought-provoking panel. So, by the way, my name is Andrew Leung. I'm a long-timer in Hong Kong. It all comes back to the fact that Hong Kong is not an independent state. And has never promised that Hong Kong would even have full autonomy. There's a high degree of autonomy, but not full autonomy. So people say that politics is the art of the possible. So we talk about the questions of transition, trade-offs, and at the end of the game is that Beijing doesn't have the confidence, because one country, two systems with universal suffrage has never been tried. Particularly, they don't have confidence in the Pan-Democrats, because looking at the whole track record. So that comes to the point of how to go to build this trust. Beijing does want the universal suffrage system to succeed, but it doesn't have the confidence for the free-for-all. And hence, there are all sorts of safeguards enshrined in the basic law. They may not be democratic, but that's the deal. Now, it comes to apart from how to improve the system of nomination, my question is is actually aimed at Audrey. About the future of the Pan-Democrats and the future of the democratic movement. Would you agree that the Pan-Democrats and the democratic movement would have more elbow room with universal suffrage? No matter how defective the system, you can try to improve in it, but you can't force Beijing's hand to give up all these safeguards. Don't forget, our sovereign power is a communist state. It's never been, you can't find any examples. You look through all these books, all the history, the professors with all this vast experience, you can't find a similar example. So this is the reality. Now, how to build the confidence, apart from, of course, making the democratic process, the nomination process as democratic as possible. Word is cheap, and confidence depends on relationships. There are no relationships at the moment. And how to build relationships, would you agree that one way to build relationship is for the Democratic Party to play a role in the new government by way of ministerial appointments? That way, then the Pan-Democrats can show that they really love, of course they love Hong Kong, but they also love the one country, and they also have the confidence of Beijing. But of course that would not happen without universal suffrage. So my question to you is that for the sake of the democratic movement, for the sake of the future of the Pan-Democrats, would you agree that you would have more elbow room with universal suffrage in 2017 rather than without? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. You put the obstacle or the blame on the Pan-Democrats as if, well, they are standing in the way of more room for democracy. I will answer you in the same way that I answered W.K. Lam, which is that Hong Kong people do want democracy. And the question is not whether Beijing trusts the Pan-Democrats. The question is whether Beijing trusts the Hong Kong people. Because when you have one person, one vote, when you have universal suffrage, it's up to Hong Kong people to choose. I mean, last time when Albert Ho ran in the CE election with the small circle election, he didn't get the popular vote, even though the popular people didn't get the vote. I mean, you excuse the pun, but then we didn't have universal suffrage, but there were polls done, and I think Albert Ho didn't get more than 20% of the poll. Therefore, I mean, it doesn't mean that the Hong Kong people will always choose a Pan-Democrat if you give them the choice. And you should not compare electoral election results with CE results, because Hong Kong people are smart and pragmatic. They know when they are choosing a electoral member, they would prefer people like long hair because, well, you know, you're choosing the opposition anyway. So why choose a loyalist? Because you're just adding to the number of functional constituency representatives. And that's why they would prefer, in those instances, to choose a Pan-Democrat. But it doesn't mean when it comes to CE election, they're necessary to do the same. So, I mean, if Beijing trusts the Hong Kong people, then let them choose. I mean, I heard so many comments today directed to me, and I suddenly felt when those comments were made that, well, now I understand why you need me on Valentine's Day. I know that people get personal in a forum, but I didn't expect it to be in that sense. And my answer to all of you is that we are talking about the system, not about individuals. I mean, we want a system that's going to work for Hong Kong. I may die tomorrow, you know? I mean, don't pocket a system because you think, well, if you have somebody like Audrey, then there's going to be a loophole and you're going to get through. I mean, it's just an interesting ploy to get you to pocket it first. But we are talking about a system that's going to last probably for a very long time, because as Professor said, there is no fine print details as to what changes we're going to have in the next 4, 5, 10, 15 years if we pocket this system. So let's not make fun of individual persons or even compliment individual persons. I mean, it's nice to have examples and nice to be the example involved. But we are really talking about a democratic system. It's going to be for our next generation. If you talk to most of the young people, if you look at the polls for the young people, I go out to write Faichun's, in this time of the year, and I have a Faichun index, because people ask me to write the words, their wishes for the new year. And this year, so many people want Faichuns, not only just for umbrella, but also for recovering. The recovery campaign, Recover Hong Kong, Recover Shui, Recover Junmun. Somebody actually wanted a Faichun to say, 香港建國. I mean, I don't think people in Hong Kong really want democracy. But I tell you, if you take this hard line, you are going to push this younger generation into a corner. And it's not going to work for Hong Kong. So be reasonable, be sensible, be rational. And don't push those who love democracy into desperation, to doing something that you regret and they regret.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Zhang Gaman, last question.
Zhang Gaman. I'm a member of the CPPCC, 全國政協, and I'm also a member of the Basic Law Consultative Committee, deeply involved in the formulation of the current political system. I want to start with a joke. Audrey said that DAB, democracy according to Beijing. I want to ask all the audience a question. Who gave democracy to Hong Kong? Under the British rule, our chief executive is always appointed only because China decided to resume the sovereignty of Hong Kong. Then the joint declaration declared that the chief executive is either returned by consultation or by election. And in the basic law, the Beijing government decides that the chief executive should be returned by democracy. More concrete is direct election. So please face the real reality. The reality is that it is Beijing that gives democracy to Hong Kong. Please look at the basic law and the history of Hong Kong and face the reality of this situation. However, Hong Kong people is quite, I would say, mistrust or have a lot of doubts against the Beijing government. It's the reality too. If you look at the order demonstration on the 1st of July, people has a lot of discontent, economic problem, social problem. And the demonstration is on the 1st of July. It is the birthday of Hong Kong under China. And if you look at the June 4th event, if you have any opinion that is deviating from the mainstream of the pro-democrats, then you will be severely criticized. I can tell you. I don't know how many of you did participate in the election of Hong Kong. I did. Many, many years ago, before the June 4th, I secured the highest votes in the history of Hong Kong District Board election. I am very sure that no one can ever break my record under the current system. However, if I decide to stand for the election again, I will be easily be defeated. Why? Because people are saying that you are a pro-government elements, then you have to pay a lot of efforts in order to win the election. I witnessed the situation between the election of Mrs. L.C. To and the godfather of democracy, Mr. Sitowa. The slogan of Mr. Sitowa was very simple. L.C. is following Chinese government, then Shui will have no chance to succeed. This is the situation. Do you think when designing the future election system of the chief executive, it is very, very legitimate of the Chinese government to consider all this into their consideration? Look at the founding fathers of US. When they are designing the system of electing the president, don't forget it is only after the French Revolution. Their intention is that they have to take all the factors into consideration. It is the elite that should decide.
Okay. All right.
No. Do you allow me to have freedom of speech, please? Yeah? Can you? Can I? Okay. I want to make my speech.
Carmen, you have 1 minute.
Okay. Please compare the current political package with the old one. Please compare it, read it, to see whether it is an improvement or not. Please, this is very important. And I agree that there is a threshold, but everyone is equal before the threshold. Am I right? So there is no preferences towards the so-called pro-establishment. If you look at the United States situation. Okay. So please help me to answer the questions raised by the chairman. Who financed the Occupy Central event, as well as why? You dare not to face all the questions I propose? You are so afraid.
No,
okay, thank you.
Let's just, okay. All right, now we've really run out of time, so I'm sorry. No more, sorry. We've run out of time. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'm sorry, we tried to cover too much in one morning. But anyway, I hope we get a better understanding of what democracy is. Thank you.
Let us thank our distinguished panel, Dr. Vincent Lo, Ms. Audrey Yu, Professor John Carey, Mr. Woon-kwong, Mr. Yok-sing, and Professor Ming.